Hello. Welcome to Module 2, Foundations of American Governance. In this module, we will discuss the importance of morality and moral character in a republic and its self-governing people. We'll also cover the benefits of a civic education. So, let's get started with Section 9, Restraint Through Virtue. We discuss auxiliary precautions such as separation of powers and checks and balances in the last section and observe how they are necessary institutional restraints on government. However, a limitation even more important to the preservation of free government is the presence of a virtuous people. Historian Joyce Appleby observed that civic virtue, the capacity to place the good of the Commonwealth above one's own, was the linchpin of constitution stability and liberty-preserving order. Experience has shown that a people will either be virtuous and free or corrupt and ruled. The founders and framers firmly believed in the necessity of virtue for the nation's durability. Writing in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, George Mason said, "No free government, nor the blessings of liberty, can be preserved to any people, but by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue, by frequent recurrence to fundamental principles, and by the recognition by all citizens that they have duties as well as rights, and that such rights cannot be enjoyed save in a society where law is respected and due process is observed." In his farewell address, George Washington asserted that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. Freedom, which is the ability to make choices without coercion, is a precondition for the development and articulation of virtue. Virtue is a voluntary action that springs from an individual's personal will and moral judgment. Absent freedom, actions, even morally upright ones, just become obedience and lack the moral value connected to genuine virtue. Methods of coercion, such as laws and legislation, do not allow people to freely exercise virtue, lead by example, or try to persuade others. A society that places value on virtue must also value freedom. Noah Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language defined virtue as moral goodness, the practice of moral duties and the abstaining from vice, or conformity of life and conversation to the moral law. At the time of the nation's founding, it was widely understood that a self-governing people who hold sovereignty need to possess a moral character. Henry Ward Beecher later said, "There is no liberty to men who know not how to govern themselves." Self-governance requires self-regulation of conduct, ambitions, and passions. Animals react to stimuli based on instinct. Whereas humans are moral beings, we are called to do the right thing. We sometimes fail to do that right thing, which is why there are laws. The founders deeply believed that the capacity for self-governance is rooted in individual and shared virtue. Writing to Mercy Warren in 1776, John Adams said, "Public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private, and public virtue is the only foundation of republics. There must be a positive passion for the public good, the public interest, honor, power, and glory, established in the minds of the people, or there can be no republican government, nor any real liberty, and this public passion must be superior to all private passions." Adams recognized that, in order to prioritize the common good, or the public virtue, citizens need to be themselves morally upright, that is, to practice private virtue, rather than malicious or depraved. He further noted, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." We discussed practical reason in Section 7. Thomas Aquinas asserted that the first principle of practical reason is, the good is to be done and pursued, the bad is to be avoided. Good in this context means both the morally good and anything that is understood to be obviously worthy, while bad refers to whatever is recognized to be a denial of comprehensible goods. People need to be willing and able to restrain their base instincts. Alexander Hamilton commented, A fondness for power is implanted in most men, and it is natural to abuse it when acquired. James Madison concurred in Federalist No. 57, the aim of every political constitution is, or ought to be, first to obtain for rulers men who possess most wisdom to discern, and most virtue to pursue, the common good of the society, and in the next place, to take the most effectual precautions for keeping them virtuous whilst they continue to hold their public trust. Citizens of a republic need to be willing to defend freedom from threats, both foreign and domestic. John Stuart Mill said, "A people may prefer a free government, but if, from indolence, or carelessness, or cowardice, or want of public spirit, they are unequal to the exertions necessary for preserving it, if they will not fight for it when directly attacked, they are more or less unfit for liberty." American historian and philosopher Will Durant observed that we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act but a habit. In other words, ethical conduct comes from habits that are built by repeated action and correction. Indeed, the word ethics comes from ethos, the Greek word for habit. Washington said in his first inaugural address that there exists in the economy and cause of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness. Indeed, in this regard, Washington modeled the ideals of the American founding. He made them a reality as commander of the Continental Army, then chose to resign his commission and return to Mount Vernon. Consider other military leaders: Julius Caesar, Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Francisco Franco. They were men who seized power and refused to relinquish it until they died or were defeated. Washington was the most admired man in North America and could have insisted on becoming King of the United States. Instead, he acquitted himself in a manner similar to Cincinnatus, the Roman statesman who, according to legend, relinquished absolute power twice, returning to his farm each time. Washington's classical education enabled him to form an awareness of character and to develop traits suitable for a gentleman in a republic of free citizens. He went on to reluctantly serve as chairman of the Constitutional Convention and as the nation's first president. He believed in the principles of government based on consent and the protection of life, liberty, and property. True to his Republican beliefs, he chose to lay aside his authority once his second term ended in 1797 and returned to private life. In refusing a third term, he set a precedent that remained in place until Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the election of 1940. King George asked the expatriate American painter Benjamin West what Washington would do after leaving the army. West answered that the general intended to return to his farm. "If he does that," the skeptical ruler said, "he will be the greatest man in the world." The moral character or virtues of the citizenry include moderation, which emphasizes balance and self-control; justice, which in this context means to uphold fairness and the rights of one's fellow citizens; prudence. Jefferson read widely of classical philosophy, including the works of Cicero. According to Cicero, prudence is the foundation of all other virtues and means using good judgment to avoid useless ideas, emotions, and labor. Courage. People writing letters in the 18th century sometimes signed themselves as classical pseudonyms. In her correspondence with her husband beginning in 1775, Abigail Adams ended with the name Portia. This individual was the wife of Marcus Brutus, one of Julius Caesar's assassins. By using the name, Abigail was associating herself with a symbol of Roman fortitude. Or writing to John Adams in 1764, Abigail asked him, "Don't you think me a courageous being? Courage is a laudable, a glorious virtue in your sex, why not in mine?" Abigail's question signaled that moral and physical courage is a worthwhile virtue for every person. Vigilance. A virtuous people must be constantly vigilant and guard against government oppression. This means being informed, being alert to threats to liberty, and holding all elected and appointed officials accountable. O. John Philpott Curran declared that, the condition upon which God hath given liberty to man is eternal vigilance, which condition if he break, servitude is at once the consequence of his crime and the punishment of his guilt. These necessary virtues are discussed in more detail in the Ethical Literacy series. Since virtue and moral goodness are necessary for government of the people, how is this to be instilled or created in the citizenry? One method is to inspire it in the people. John Adams said to Zebediel Adams in 1776, "The only foundation of a free constitution is pure virtue, and if this cannot be inspired into our people, in a greater measure than they have it now, they may change their rulers, and the forms of government, but they will not obtain a lasting liberty." The other method is through formal and informal education. The founders accepted the imperfect nature of humankind and embedded the preservation of liberty into the text of the Constitution. Still, they knew that only a moral and virtuous people could defend the rights of themselves and their fellow Americans. John Adams wrote to Benjamin Waterhouse in 1805 and observed, "The encouragement of literature, wisdom, and knowledge, as well as virtue, diffused generally among the body of the people, being necessary for the preservation of their rights and liberties, and as these depend on spreading the opportunities and advantages of education in the various parts of the country and among the different orders of the people, it shall be the duty of the legislatures and magistrates to cherish the interests of literature and the sciences, and all seminaries of them." Benjamin Franklin likewise advocated for character education. "The principal end of education is, to form us wise and good creatures, useful to others, and happy ourselves." The whole art of education lies within a narrow compass, and is reducible to a very simple practice, namely, to assist in unfolding those natural and moral powers with which man is endowed, by presenting proper objects and occasions, to watch their growth that they be not diverted from their end, or disturbed in their operation by any foreign violence, and gently to conduct and apply them to all the purposes of private and of public life. Many of the founders, such as Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, openly favored using public education as a process for cultivating public virtue. Jefferson advocated the liberal arts as a means of liberating people from tyrants and demagogues, then enabling them to rule themselves. He said, "Every government degenerates when trusted to the rulers of the people alone. The people themselves therefore are its only safe depositories. And to render even them safe, their minds must be improved to a certain degree. An amendment of our Constitution must here come in aid of the public education." There was disagreement among the founding era's leaders as to the level of the federal government's involvement in public education. For instance, George Washington, Benjamin Rush, and James Madison advocated for a national public university that would function as a sort of graduate school. In the end, though, local colleges and universities, parents, and churches all played a role in developing the next generation of American leaders. Frederick Rudolph noted that early America saw a widely held belief that the colleges were now serving a new responsibility to a new nation, the preparation of young men for responsible citizenship in a republic that must prove itself, the preparation for lives of usefulness of young men who also intended to prove themselves. State universities were mainly intended for the cultivation of Republican civic duty, while childhood education remained a local concern, as the family and religious institutions emphasized moral and civic virtue. These entities all had the opportunity to transmit to each generation the foundational virtues necessary for a free society to endure: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Writing to Richard Price in 1789, Thomas Jefferson said, "Wherever the people are well informed they can be trusted with their own government, that whenever things get so far wrong as to attract their notice, they may be relied on to set them to rights." Next time. In the next video, we'll wrap up Module 2 by finishing the discussion on the right to alter or abolish unjust government. We'll cover the structural mechanisms for change that are built into law, as well as the public mechanisms. And, We'll finish by talking about the final cost of the United States. Until then, thank you for your time. If you want to learn more about the subjects we have discussed, here are the sources used for this section.